Welcome back to the Simpleton Podcast. All right, today we have Melanie Takinen to the Simpleton Podcast. I'm going to tell you who she is. But before I do that, let me ask, please share our podcast through social media. Send it to a friend through an email, but also just post on social media. It makes a pretty big difference in the number of people exposed to some of these ideas. I know no one agrees with all the ideas on this podcast, but maybe you like the tone, or maybe you just like to see Audrey and Laura disagree with me on things. So whatever, please share the podcast. Makes a big difference. We've got a very loyal audience, but it would be good if it grew just a little bit. All right, next thing. Okay, Melanie, she works for VIRTUS. We all know what that is because it's mandated in almost every single diocese. Now, VIRTUS is, about, protecting children. Melanie also worked for the USCCB in the Secretariat of Child and Youth Protection. Okay. This podcast has done a lot on the church sex abuse crisis starting back in 2001 when it started. And we've got a 4-part series that if you really want to go blow by blow and deeply understand it, I would do this 4-part series. Laura and I read all the Vatican's response. We talk about how we knew Cardinal McCarrick and different people involved in the crisis. And the search term is probably CSAS. That's what we labeled our YouTube videos on A Simple House U. So you could find it. It's part 1 through part 4. We go through the original stuff, PA grand jury, and the McCarrick report. Okay. All right. Now, many people in this who listen are newly Catholic or haven't been paying attention to this, maybe on purpose. And I need to give like a brief flyover of the thing so that you're not guessing what happened. Okay. In 2001, the Boston Globe did article after article just going after the Boston Archdiocese, exposing how they had transferred priests and how they'd had predators in the priesthood. Okay. Quickly, this was recognized to not be a Boston problem, but to be a national problem. And it was admitted even by the Catholics that this is a big problem and it needs fixed. Okay. And a reform happened. Lawsuits happened and reform happened. And the reform even came all the way from the Vatican, and it covered seminaries. And Simple House was beginning in like 2003. I think I said 2001. It happened in 2002, and Simple House begins in 2003. And we're working with seminaries, some of which are literally closed due to this reform. Okay. And we also are working with bishops who are later removed due to problems with this crisis. Okay. So it starts in 2002. The church gets an enormous black eye, takes action, and the church just kind of putters along being the butt of jokes on this subject, but still, operating, Catholics, still proclaiming Jesus until about 2018 when the Pennsylvania grand jury report comes out. And with this report, there was really no new information. In fact, the biggest piece of new information was a report saying that the reforms had worked. They said that this report is primarily about things that happened before the reforms. So before 2002, basically, right? And what was so shocking about the report is instead of it just saying, hey, someone had a credible accusation and they were transferred or this happened, it actually just was detailed reports of sexual abuse, just literally descriptions of the abuse, right? So it deeply upset people. And people who had, in a sense, kind of closed their eyes and, held their nose during the initial crisis, which I wasn't one of those. I cared about. By the time the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out, I was like, why is anyone upset? We knew this. There's no new information here. But for a lot of people, they were able to ignore the first version. And when the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out, nearly 15 years later, they were rocked. Because I don't think they had taken seriously what had been revealed in 2002. Okay. And also that year, a McCarrick report comes out. And the McCarrick report, most of the accusations were he was kind of a vicious social climber. He had abused seminarians and had homosexual relationships. And he is suspected and accused of having assaulted people back in the 70s who were minors. And it was enough that he was guilty and needed removed. It wasn't nearly as graphic or anything as the Pennsylvania grand jury stuff, but he was removed. He was already a retired cardinal at that point. We'd met him multiple times at Simple House because we were from the Washington Archdiocese where we were founded while McCarrick was cardinal. And then the other person who was removed was Worrell, who took over from McCarrick. He got removed because he was a bishop in Pennsylvania during the Pennsylvania grand jury reports time period, like the 90s, right? And there was just a huge loss of faith. There was like, hey, look, you didn't really clean up the McCarrick mess. We don't even know if you knew about it. We also don't know that McCarrick did anything wrong while he was in D.C. That was never in the reports as far as I could tell. And we just, there's just a loss of faith, and he needed to step down due to just a loss of faith in leadership, And then there was also the case of the Kansas City bishop, which is weird because there's like 4 bishops who lost their job over this. Law in Boston, McCarrick, Worrell, and then Bishop Finn here in Kansas City. And he lost his job for a better reason than Worrell. And I say Worrell, my problem is that every bishop in the 90s, 80s, and maybe 70s probably did not handle it as well as they could have. By today's standards, they all mishandled it, right? Finn's problem was he became a bishop after the sex abuse crisis had happened, and he fumbled a case in 2011. And it was kind of unthinkable that someone would mishandle one of these cases after we had just gotten so mad at the clergy for mishandling these cases. And that's why he was removed. And so we knew him too. He's been at Simple House. It's just wild. There was a point where I talked to our bishop and I'm like, look, every bishop I've ever worked with has been removed due to the church sex abuse crisis. All right. What were the big lessons here? Okay. This is, once again, if you weren't paying attention, here's your flyover. All major institutions have these problems. If you've got a big power structure with any size at all, there will be abuse. And if you don't have an overt system to handle it, it will be bad. There will be cover-ups and people will protect the prestige of the organization. And if your organization works with kids, be it an orphanage or a school or any type of camp or whatever, you're going to have predators operating. And if you're not weeding them out, you're in trouble. And you may never be able to get the number to 0, but you can get the number way down, and as the church has since the 2002 situation. Okay. And this is just true. And I'm recording this podcast at the point when the U.S. government has denied that Jeffrey Epstein was sex trafficking minors, and that just is not an issue, nothing to see here. And they're clearly protecting either themselves or politicians or the intelligence agencies. It's just the same story. It's just like abusers operate, maybe even are condoned by the intelligence establishment or something. And then people try to cover it up, even when the evidence is very clear, right? This also happened in all types of other non-Catholic settings. Okay. So the second point would be the systems you need to create have to have outside bodies. You have to have people who are able to step in the Catholic Church. You need laity. You can't have priests judging priests. You need ombudsmen. You need these other structures for reporting. You can't just report the problem with the youth minister to the priest in charge of the parish. You've got to go beyond that. That was one of the things we learned. And a lot of the reforms that we might talk about today were part of that solution. The other thing is there was a problem of not dealing with sexuality well in priestly formation. There was either a laxness, like, everything's forgivable, don't worry about it, which just kind of led to poor sexual morality, or there was a repression where it was like, how dare you even have the temptation? And then people start repressing their sexuality, and then you get also really weird, manifestations of the sexuality. That's been largely reformed. That's a very difficult reform. There's no clear playbook on how to help people through those problems, but that's an issue. One of the big, this should be a separate point, but one of the things that led to the church scandal was society thought that abusers were curable. Psychologists were making money, literally, getting hired by the church to run retreat centers, to give therapies to abusers and cure them. Okay. So it would be like, if you were a bishop in the 80s, you'd think, I got this priest who has a problem. I'm told it's curable if we just pay this person however many thousands of dollars. He'll go on this thing and he'll come back and he'll be cured of his predatory behavior. Okay. There wasn't good evidence that it was curable. And it wasn't just the church who bought into kind of the lie that it was curable. The church kind of, in my mind, deserted its own core values of like virtue and sin and temptation and that type of understanding of a problem, and went towards a psychological model that failed to the point it hurt children. The other thing in the background of this is family versus society. Up until the 1870s in America, family always handled these issues. If there's child sex abuse, the family needs to handle it. The police did not intervene. And the first time we start intervening as a society within families to like in the usually the worst cases was in the late 1800s. Okay. And now today we even are at the point where we're literally making rules that if your kid wants to have surgeries or change their name or whatever, the parents don't even have the right to know. So now we're at the point where society is so far intervened in family life. It's just kind of nuts. But clearly, in the most extreme cases, we need people intervening in family life. It's kind of a subsidiarity question. Should the family solve problems within the family? Yes. Can the family solve these worst problems? Probably not. They probably need help from outside. That help is usually the legal system, okay? Or child protective services, which is an arm of the legal system, essentially. So the church was often treated as a family, like a problem within the church needed to be sorted by the church, like keep it internal. That didn't work, but I don't want to say the opposite's also true, that always intervening is the right thing, and always basically having your church run by the legal system isn't the right thing either. But clearly in this case, we needed some intervention. And I think in many ways, I'm just thankful that everything came out in 01. And I thought, the 2018 stuff, I don't know that was good that came out. And I was really worried because that was just a Pennsylvania grand jury report. Every attorney general in the nation who wanted to grandstand could have issued their own report. Thankfully, it didn't become a domino effect where we were just going to hear about every couple of years a new grand jury report just detailing abuse from before 2001. I don't think that led to meaningful reform, but the Boston Globe stuff did. All right, on to the interview. Welcome, Melanie Takinen, to the Simpleton Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. You work with the VIRTUS program. You've also worked with the USCCB. Can you give us a little background on yourself? And then I kind of want to talk about the origin of the VIRTUS program.
Yeah, absolutely. So myself, I've been working in child abuse prevention and healing within the church and within that ministry for about 15 years. I started actually working in the Diocese of Phoenix as their director of safe environment training, did that for a while, and then from there moved on to the U.S. Bishops Conference in Washington, D.C. as the associate director in the Secretariat of Child and Youth Protection. Did that for a while as well. And then after, DC was fabulous, but started to miss home in Arizona. So after about 4 years there, decided it was time to move back home to Arizona, which is where I'm from and my family is. So from then I started working with the VIRTUS programs back in 2020 and have been working with them since then in child protection. So I've kind of seen the evolution from both just the national scale in terms of child protection and what that's looked like in recent years, and then from VIRTUS as well.
I've met a couple of people who work for the Diocese of Phoenix. I'm just curious, do you know, there was a guy named Phelan. His brother was Mike Phelan, and then there was also Bishop Olmsted. Did you know both of them?
I did. Yeah. When I was there, Bishop Olmsted was still the bishop, and so he was still there. Definitely interacted with him, and then yeah, Mike was great. I worked with him a little bit. We were a few offices down from each other, so it was
right.
Yeah, good to work with him as well.
Good. But VIRTUS is actually based out of Tulsa. Is that right?
It is, yeah. So VIRTUS runs the office out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm remote, so I kind of join in, from Phoenix to give a little representation from the desert, from the west side. But yes, our help desk runs out of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
how did you get into it in 15 years ago? Like, were you just like someone who they thought, all right, you've got some talent, let's throw you into this? It's hard to think that someone has a background in, sex abuse prevention, right? Like, do you have like a psychology background, or like, how did you get into this?
This is not one of those fields that, like, when you're in kindergarten, you're like, when I grow up, I want to be an abuse prevention, specialist or anything like that. I will say it was kind of just a natural progression. It was shortly after I graduated with my master's in psychology, and I just, really wanted to kind of get back into church ministry, but in really just somehow in the realm of almost like social services within the church. And so this opportunity became available, and lo and behold, the stars aligned and really just kind of hit the ground running in that. So I did do a little bit of social work prior to coming to the diocese as well. But yeah, when you talk to people in the field, everybody does tend to have very diverse backgrounds, which I think just shares a lot about the ministry.
Right. Can you tell us when VIRTUS started? I mean, knowing that the big Boston Globe, like, breaking stories that started the scandal were like '02, is VIRTUS from before then, or when did VIRTUS start?
Great question. So actually, Virtus was conceptualized in 1997. So at that time, the National Catholic Risk Retention Group, which is the parent company for the VIRTUS programs, but in that time in 1997, the then who was chairman of the board, Monsignor Kevin McCoy, he brought up a question to everybody on the board to say, hey, what are we doing in the church to protect children from sexual abuse and other harm? And at that time, the answer was nothing. Nobody was doing any sort of training or prevention or anything like that to protect children specifically within ministries in the church. So, based on that, they started to do a little bit of research. The board actually got together 60 experts within the field of child abuse prevention and child sexual abuse. And first, just asked the question, can we prevent child sexual abuse in an organizational setting? And if so, how do we do that? So there was a lot of really research and discussion that went into kind of these initial conversations, because even at the time in society, there wasn't really a program dedicated to preventing abuse on a national level. I mean, there was your mandated reporter training that kind of was happening in society, which is definitely important, but that's a little bit different than when you're looking at how do you respond and prevent abuse in an organization. Because we know within the Catholic Church, we're a huge child serving organization, right? As we work with, Catholic schools and parishes and all that. So through the initial research of formulating the program, it was how do we kind of take what we know in the field and these best practices and research and put it into a training program. So by the time kind of that process kept moving forward, by the late 2001 is really when the program started being piloted. So it was already kind of being put into action, at least in some dioceses, prior to the Boston Globe article in January of 2002.
What was adoption like before '02, and then what was adoption like afterwards?
So prior to '02, I would say it was more of, because it was being piloted, so it wasn't really widely advertised at that point yet, because it was so more of, hey, the board was kind of talking to some of the dioceses they were working with, and how do we kind of get the ball rolling? So it was adopted in that sense in some dioceses. Even prior to that, I mean, there were dioceses that were doing something for child prevention and something for protection. It just certainly wasn't on a national scale. But that being said, now, of course, after 2002, that's when the bishops all got together and created as they do every year, but their June meeting specifically focused on the topic of child sexual abuse and what do we do about it. So they created the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People, and that came out in June of 2002. And that's really the guiding force of not only having accountability, resources for survivors who've been harmed within the church, but also for prevention and kind of what that needs to look like on a diocesan scale.
I know that, like, after the Boston Globe hit, I was paying attention, and I believe that Benedict Rochelle, I don't want to misquote him, was like, dioceses knew there was like something bad that could be revealed about them for a decade before this happened, and that they were worried about. And I know from another diocese, they talked about an accountant came forward and said, we need to start saving money in case there's lawsuits on this, So to me, there was like a certain amount of foreshadowing that, a scandal could happen, right? Can you talk about like who founded VIRTUS? Like, it was actually an insurance company, right? And then do you know anything about that time period, or are you kind of picking it up after the scandal happens and we're trying to implement the solution?
So I'm a little bit of the history I'm aware of, certainly not, kind of what went on in conversations or things like that. I can't get into that detail, but you're right. I think in a lot of instances prior to the Boston Globe articles, I mean, the writing was on the wall in a sense. There were some publicized cases, but at that time, I think a lot of the broader thinking was, well, it happened in that area. Like
Right.
it's not a national issue. It's just something, it was kind of localized because again, only a few cases were kind of ever given that publicity and brought forward. So I think the awareness was certainly starting to rise. And I think part of that is why that question came up at that time frame. But again, it didn't really get that full measure of adoption until 2002. Now, that being said, in the early 90s, the bishops actually, again, because there were some of these cases, even though it was thought to be more kind of localized and not necessarily national, they did come out with a series of documents called Restoring Trust. And they did, I think there's 3 different volumes on that, where they kind of started the groundwork almost of accountability, transparency, training and kind of things like that. But there wasn't kind of any teeth behind it. It was more like, hey, here's kind of something we're thinking of in recommendations. So again, it was adopted in some dioceses to at least start it, but certainly nothing on the national level that we really saw with the charter.
Now that there's like teeth in it, are the teeth coming from like the Vatican or the USCCB, like telling people they really need to do this? Or is this coming from lawsuits, like as like a settlement clause, or like what level of adoption do we have now? Are you guys in every diocese? And also what caused the adoption?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So as far as safe environment training, that is happening in every diocese. Now, not every diocese uses VIRTUS. Some of them may use a different training program. Now there's 196 dioceses across the US. We work with, and eparchies, we work with 130. So we're certainly, one of the major training organizations that are being used by dioceses. But as far as the kind of the teeth and where that comes from, when the bishops created the charter, because the USCCB essentially is synonymous for all the bishops, right? Because they're the ones it's their kind of group. But they actually implemented an audit process. So every diocese goes through an audit process that's done by an external auditing firm to make sure that they're doing what they said they would be doing in the charter. Now, along with that, there is also essential norms as part of the charter. Those were adopted in 2006, and that is particular law, church law within the United States. So they kind of have that both. They have, the charter, which is essentially the agreement part, but then they do have the more intensive teeth, which is the church law. Now, on the national scale or the international scale with the Vatican, they didn't really start kind of implementing requirements really until Pope Francis, in more recent years when he came out with like Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which really said, hey, now on a global scale, you have to have child protection standards in place. So the United States has been doing it since the early 2000s, but we were still seeing other countries, worldwide that maybe hadn't even started anything until that started coming out from the Vatican level.
That's my understanding. I want to ask you about the international issue, because it was Boston, and then it was like admitted to be everywhere, and then it's admitted to be actually international.
Exactly.
But so I want to ask you about that, but I also want to ask you about church law, because I've never heard that concept used in regards to the USCCB. I've always understood that the USCCB as kind of like a voluntary organization that's not an official level in the church. It's not cardinal, it's not pope, it's not bishop, which would be official, right? And that maybe they could do best practices or shame you if you don't want to do something as a bishop, but they're not actually able to force anything. Is there like a legal structure within the USCCB? Or like when you say church law, is that canon law from the Vatican, or what is that?
Yeah, I was referring to that the essential norms became canon law for the U.S. church. So not for a global scale. So it's not going to be, well, now they've done the revisions to canon law. So there's some of it included in there now, but previously to that, it was just specific for the U.S.
But the lawmaking body would be the Vatican, right? So did they have to like caveat, just for the U.S., here's some new canon law?
That's pretty much what the essential norms are.
That's great. That's funny to know that.
You're absolutely right about the USCCB and kind of what they are, that they are the bishops. They're not like a governing entity. Like the USCCB themselves, they can't, like you said, tell a specific bishop, what to do, because ultimately their USCCB is there to serve the bishops.
Okay. All right. So the Vatican was involved in that. Now, so two questions. Well, first I'll just say this. How has VIRTUS affected the international scene? Like, do you have other nations coming and like creating a copy of the VIRTUS for Ireland or for these other nations?
So internationally, we do work with a few different other dioceses outside of the United States. A lot of the European countries, they started kind of developing their own training. So we're not necessarily working with many of them. But, our main thing is as long as you're doing the training, you're doing what you can to protect kids, that's great. But primarily we're working within U.S. dioceses.
How has, from the initial like program, that was adopted after '02, how much has changed in either the strategy of VIRTUS or the tactics you guys are using to like cure the problem?
So right now we're on version 4 of our training. So it started in, late 2001 with version 1, and we've done kind of slow iterations throughout the year. One of the biggest changes from where we are now in our training, I think, to where we were initially is over 20 years ago when we first developed the program, there just wasn't the same level of awareness of sexual abuse in general and child sexual abuse in general in society as we have today. Now we've had the Me Too movement. We have, stories are actually getting attention. Survivors are being believed, whereas that wasn't always the case, decades ago. So kind of in the early stages, we had to be a little bit more almost dramatic in a sense with the training and really help people understand the scope of the problem and tell them why it was a problem. Because we also, prior to that, were battling, the mindset in society of, oh, well, people can just get over it. It's not really a big deal. And so we had to help people understand why, and many times it's not something you can just get over. Here's the impact that it can have on those who have experienced abuse. Here's why it's so important to prevent it, and really help them understand that. And then from there, give them the tools on what they can do to appropriately respond to it if they suspect or hear about it happening, and then also to prevent it. So kind of the early version was a lot more of that, again, kind of drama story, making sure people kind of had that connection to it. And then versus now, we were able to kind of go a little bit less on that and a little bit more on here's kind of the best practices and here's kind of how to take it to the next level.
That was interesting to me in the McCarrick report that there was this mother in the 80s trying to file something, like trying to alert the church that McCarrick was a problem. And she did not know the word pedophile and she did not know the word grooming. You know what I mean? And I think that it reminded me of we get off topic on this podcast, but there was a band in the 70s, I think, called the Carpenters. And the lead singer was a very beautiful voice and she died of anorexia. And when she died of anorexia, everybody's like, what's anorexia? Mm-hmm. Like it was just a word that had been a professional, psychology word, not a mainstream word. Right. And that kind of thing blows most people away today because we're now at a point where people are trying to, we've had How to Catch a Predator. We've had, Law and Order SVU. We've had, like you're almost like inundated all the time with the word grooming, pedophile, trafficking, sex abuse. You know what I mean? To the point it's almost like, give me a break, But like before it was like these concepts were just not in the mainstream. Is that what VIRTUS found or?
Absolutely. So we almost had to kind of define what some of this, was. Like this is what sexual abuse is. And we still do that today too, just to make sure that nobody can say they didn't know, or can kind of come away from the training of, oh, well, I didn't realize that was grooming or anything like that. So we do still do that to an extent, but there was a little bit more of that, just helping people understand the problem. Because any of these issues in society, I mean, for so long, sexual abuse was considered taboo. So kids didn't want to talk about it. If they tried to share, for so many different reasons, if they tried to share, with an adult, a lot of times they weren't believed because again, it was like, well, no, what's that? No, that person would never do that. Not understanding the giant picture behind it and all the manipulation that's done from the abuser. And you're right, even just referring to people of, as an abuser or something like that was never really talked about. And oh, that's just our neighbor, Tim. And, he's just like that. And it was kind of like, no, don't go over there by yourself. Like people knew, but it was never actually addressed.
So there was a big gap between the first time I took the VIRTUS program and taking it yesterday, literally, just kind of getting ready to talk to you. And in the meantime, I took the Scouts program for Boy Scouts of America, or a Cub Scout program. Mm-hmm. And the first time I took VIRTUS, which I think I had assumed it had frozen in time and that you guys hadn't been iterating, I remember it being like interviews of literally guys who were perpetrators explaining what they did so that people understood what grooming was and stuff, right? And very much awareness work, I feel like, right? Which is what we've just been saying, right? And then I felt like awareness caught up. And then when I took the Scouts training a couple months ago, I was like, oh, these are just rules. Like the Scouts were just like, hey, look, here's the rules for tents. Here's the rules for showers. Here's the rules for swimming. Here's the rules if a kid feels uncomfortable. Here's the rules. And if you see someone break these things, you'll get on them, And it wasn't like testimonies and like, let's talk to a predator about what he does, and then when I retook VIRTUS, it seemed like it was almost like a medium, like it had the rules in a sense, like these are the things you need to call out, even if they just make you uncomfortable, even if they're not an overt violation, you just need to call it out, like bad boundaries, say, right? I thought that was interesting the way it had evolved. Do you have has VIRTUS been able to figure out that amongst all the church's reforms, what role VIRTUS has played? Like, do you know that what you're doing is working as opposed to, say, the reform of the seminaries and having an ombudsman at the diocese and all the other reforms that happened? Do we know that VIRTUS works?
So here's one of the things that I would say, that because we do get asked that question a lot, which is understandable. I mean, people are putting resources and time into getting people trained. So what do we know about it? The first thing I would say is that anytime we have an opportunity to talk about this issue, it's definitely going to be a positive. Just because, to your point earlier, when people are familiar with something, then they're more likely to actually act on it if there is an issue or something comes up. Along with that, though, it can be difficult to prove that something doesn't happen. So we can't specifically say, hey, because of these steps, we prevented this situation of abuse from happening, because then we prevented it. So there's no way to know for sure, kind of where maybe what would have happened there. But what we do know is people are communicating concerns earlier. So people are communicating if they do see a concern about a boundary issue. We also know the other side of the spectrum too. Children are starting to communicate if they feel like their boundaries are violated, or if they feel like an adult is making them uncomfortable or unsafe. So those are the two areas where I feel the strongest that we can show training is working, because people have the tools they need to communicate about something before it escalates into further harm.
I want to ask about that. So my ministry works with the poor, and since the inception of our ministry, sex trafficking has become an enormous issue, right? And I don't know that it's actually become an enormous issue, meaning like the problem got bigger, but the way people talk about it has completely changed, right? And one of the things that bugs me about it is, like, I'll be at some place like a police station or even a bathroom at a truck stop or something, and it'll be like, look for someone whose eyes avert, or, look for someone who doesn't want to answer your questions, right? And it's like showing me like these like kind of secondary signs, right? Which I don't disagree with, but none of them are really reportable, right? I can't call the police and say, I met a shy woman at the truck stop today. Can you do something? Can you come investigate, right? And the other thing that also bugs me is when they do opposites. And they do this with child sex abuse because maybe it's just true, but it always weirds me out. It's like if the child becomes very, very shy or very, very outspoken, like either way, it could be a sign, Do you have any thoughts on that?
So a lot of in terms of child sexual abuse, if we're looking at kind of behavioral indicators, one of the things that we share in the training is we say, hey, if you see one of these behavioral indicators, it could be abuse, but it could be, something else is going on. So yeah, we don't want you to see one of these behavioral indicators and then immediately, you're contacting law enforcement or anything like that, because yeah. So as an example, like if you, to that extreme of you mentioned where you did have, let's say a kid in a class who was always just so excited and, they loved life. They always wanted to answer questions and talk to the teacher. And then, if it's, and I would say, is it a pattern of them now maybe changing that behavior? So if it's one day they come in and they're like a little sulky, we all have bad days. I wouldn't say at that point that's a behavioral indicator, but if maybe there's a consistent piece where, lately they just seem like they're not wanting to kind of be outgoing anymore. Maybe they're avoiding their friends. They're not speaking up in class. Maybe they look like they're coming in tired all the time. That where it's kind of a little bit more, you had kind of some time to gauge it. And then what we recommend is start off by just having a conversation, open-ended with them. Hey, I noticed that maybe you haven't wanted to spend time with your friends. Is everything okay? Or by one of my favorite phrases is tell me about that. So you're not even asking a specific question. You're kind of leaving it more open-ended for them. But yeah, certainly to your point, if a kid falls asleep in class once, it's not something to where I'm worried about calling law enforcement. But let's just find out a little bit more about that.
I've also had experiences of calling law enforcement and reporting things to hotlines and things like this, right? And I've given all my concerns, and I go in and out of a lot of houses where kids are vulnerable, right? Because our ministry will, with partners, be visiting houses where things could happen, right? And I've had my report refused multiple times, because I somehow did not have a bright line standard that I had crossed to warrant the hotline to take action, right? And at the end of me kind of giving all my reasons why I'm concerned, they'll say,
thank you.
I'm not taking a report, basically, right? And it almost made me think that the way to go about it, this is not for Virtus or the church, it's more like for our work out in society, but it's just to ask the police to do a welfare check to see if they sniff anything out, because me just saying I see signs of neglect or, something like that is just not good enough. Or if I have hearsay evidence from another adult in the family, that seems to not be good enough, and I do know that some of this is also state by state. So one state might react differently than another, but I've just been kind of surprised at how high a standard it takes to get action sometimes.
Okay. And that is a challenge when you're communicating something that, to you is, hey, I have a suspicion of at least there's a reason I'm calling, I'm not just calling because
or like I see 30, 40 bad situations and this one sticks out,
Yeah, exactly. Now every child protection agency, and depending on the state, like you said, is going to have kind of a little bit of a different, here's what our threshold is, or here's our practices. And it can be a challenge sometimes when you communicate something and nothing is done, or it seems as though nothing is done. Because sometimes, we may not know what is being done in the background. I mean, they're not, as much as we would love to find out, they're not going to call us and tell us, hey, just so you know, we did this investigation. So one of the things that we recommend through VIRTUS is, hey, anytime you do have that concern, yes, still make a phone call or an online report, however you report in the state or in somebody's area. But if you then notice something again, make another report. If you come back another day and you have the exact same concerns, if something else happened or maybe I have new information, make another report, because anytime we can give them additional information, we don't know at what point in time that little piece of information we have is going to tip the scales enough to where they can start the investigation, or to where, it is going to kind of open a file as well. So we again, not knowing what's going to happen, we can only do what we can do. And when we have concerns, let's communicate those.
In your opinion, are there more things the church should be doing now to protect children that we're not doing? Or do you think we just need to keep iterating what we are doing because we're on a successful path?
I mean, I definitely think we don't want to get comfortable with where we're at. One of the buzzwords I hear, thrown around a lot by like the auditor sometimes, and it'll sometimes, and it'll come up in meetings and whatnot, is the word complacency. So I think if we are kind of on that path where, what, we've dealt with this issue, right? We're good. We can kind of just keep the bar at a minimum. I think that's when we're opening ourselves up maybe to something else happening, or to a greater risk, or to kind of something dropping the ball. So I would say we definitely want to continue with everything that's we're doing within the church, continue with the training, continue with the accountability, review boards that can, help assess if they get an allegation coming in, resources for those that have experienced abuse, all that. We definitely need to continue, but also with the mindset of, we don't want to get comfortable. So one of the things that we have through VIRTUS to try to help combat that as well is we come out with new trainings. So not only do we update the Protecting God's Children program every, certain number of years, we come up with additional trainings on different topics relating to abuse prevention as well, just to kind of help keep that from a different perspective, but still related to child sexual abuse, but just keep it at the forefront of people's minds, so that they can, again, kind of always just maintaining that vigilance. So not overreacting, but not underreacting is really kind of the fine line we want to be on.
So these other programs, I'm aware of the programs that are necessary to become like a volunteer at a kid's school, right? They're mandated. They tell you what you have to take, right? But if you've got more programs beyond that, who are taking those programs?
So it's going to ultimately depend on kind of the diocese. And then, if they're doing, for example, renewal training every certain number of years, they might use like one of our trainings on healthy boundaries. We also have a healthy boundaries training that's specific for clergy. So we've had a lot of, and that one just came out a couple of years ago. So we've had a lot of groups that have said, hey, we want to give updated training to all of our priests. And they've used that training program just to help, again, continue their formation in healthy boundaries and kind of what that looks like and what they should be watching for within their congregations, as well, for any kind of potential concerns.
What about the world outside the church and maybe the church's role in commenting or talking? Like I'm seeing now, like, the British government is under a huge scandal about, they call it grooming gangs or rape gangs, that they were not persecuting, not intervening in. And when you kind of get on the British media about this, like in the social media world, like X, and see how people are responding, they're like, the Catholic Church took this really serious. It's like, finally, we're being held up as like the model of someone who took things seriously,
It's about time.
And, yeah. And it's embarrassing that, that our government can't figure this out or take it seriously. And even in America, at the time we record this, the whole sex trafficking, Jeffrey Epstein scandal is kind of big. And
yeah.
And we're also coming out of a period where trans issues were so forced, where it was like kids could, elect almost for surgeries without telling their parents, and people who basically had mental illnesses were being allowed in spaces that we wouldn't allow adults in with children anyway, Does Virtus or the church or the USCCB speak out on these type of issues, because like, it seems like we're holding ourselves now to a pretty good standard. Are you offering your services outside the church?
So for Virtus, we do work with some non-Catholic organizations, some, maybe from other Christian denominations, but we also work with non-faith-based communities, some like public schools, some different like agencies and kind of things like that, other smaller child serving organizations. So we do have it available, but because kind of our main focus has typically been in the church, that's just tended to be who we've worked with the most, because we want to, again, put our resources into the dioceses and the church that we're serving. But we also do want to make it available to other entities, knowing that this information is important for anybody. And it's critical for any child serving organization to do that. So we do certainly work outside of the Catholic Church as well. As far as like kind of sharing some of this information as well, and kind of the greater with some of these other issues you were bringing up. With Virtus, we also are very careful to stay in our lane, where we want to have our main focus be child sexual abuse prevention and how an appropriate response to that as well. So we kind of try to maintain in that arena, and some of these other broader questions about other church issues, we tend to leave more to the dioceses and the local bishops to kind of address from that point.
Yes, I guess I don't really have a follow-up question. I guess I'm just kind of like, I feel like the church is a special place. It's God's kingdom, kind of corporally embodied. Is everyone at Virtus Catholic, or do you have non-Catholics
that are working for Virtus?
Yes.
Specifically those working for Virtus that were Catholic.
Yeah. Okay. But like, I think the church needs a special standard and all of this, right? But to the extent we're just saying we need to speak up for children, which we do, it just seems like there's a lot of stuff going on right now that deserves comment. But I guess we just leave that to the bishops or to Catholics themselves to speak out. It's not like the sex abuse prevention arm of the Catholic Church is meant to speak out on this, or do you think that you should?
It really, I mean, in my sense in it, and this is kind of the same from when I was, obviously working at the USCCB, it was a little bit different because then the bishops would come out with, here's kind of our collective on what we want to say and talk about. Like when, for example, when the McCarrick, situation hit and all that kind of stuff, like a lot of bishops were responding to it independently, but then also the USCCB kind of came out with a response. So you kind of have that element to an extent. But as far as like sharing information about what's being done for sexual abuse prevention, kind of what the church is doing on a diocesan level, that's kind of our workflow, is to give resources to dioceses that they can then kind of share about it, because they're the ones that have the ear essentially of the community and can kind of share some of those resources. Where at Virtus, we're just directing our resources and making them available for them. So we have that work, that connection where they can kind of then disseminate. But that's kind of always been our structure, is to say, hey, we're here as your training and we can provide you with resources and materials, but then they can go out and share the information from there.
What do you wish people knew about Virtus or misunderstand about Virtus? What would you like to clarify?
So I think one of the biggest questions that sometimes I hear is, well, why do I have to take this training? Maybe it's somebody that doesn't volunteer with kids all the time, or, they say, well, I'm just a volunteer or whatnot. So how does this kind of impact me? And what I would say is the issue of child sexual abuse and preventing it and responding to it, it's not any one person's job. It's not the job of the person that's, say, the catechist or the youth minister or anything like that. It's going to take the entire community working together to really address this issue. And even if somebody's not working directly with kids, they can still be kind of the eyes and ears to help protect them. So they may observe another adult who is interacting with a kid that maybe, they have a concern about that behavior. Also, typically our adult employees and volunteers, even if they're not working directly with children or with the vulnerable, they're typically seen as trustworthy people. So we also never know if there is a child or a vulnerable person who's maybe experiencing harm or is suffering. We don't know who they may pick to possibly disclose to or to communicate with, to say, hey, I need help. And if we have an adult who hasn't had any training on how to handle that, then they may not know what steps to take. So it's both kind of, we want you to help watch out for our whole community. We're not asking you to be trained because we think you're part of the problem. We're asking you to be trained because we want you to be part of the solution. Whether or not you're working directly with kids, we can all have this huge impact. So really that's what I would say, is just it's so important for people to be trained. And I know it takes time, it takes commitment. So I really appreciate everybody that is going through the training, because it is so important and makes such a difference.
I really don't have any more questions for you, but have you ever heard this story about how the first Child and Family Services Division was created in the U.S.?
No.
And what it had to do with the Humane Society?
I have heard that the Humane Society was actually created first. So before, in our country, before we were protecting children, we were protecting animals.
Right. So there's this story of a missionary that kind of sounds like a Simple House missionary, but she was Methodist in the 1870s in New York, who was going door to door, and she found a girl who was who'd been adopted, and she was being abused severely. And like everyone in the apartment complex knew this girl was being abused. And the missionary could not figure out how to intervene. Like they'd gone to the police. The police were like, that's a family matter. They weren't interested in getting involved in family matters, And so she was like at the dinner table with her family saying, I don't know how to help this girl, but something needs done. And then one of the kids was like, I know people so crazy that if they see a man mistreating his donkey, they'll go kidnap the donkey. We should tell those people that this girl's being abused. And so they went and found the Animal Protection Society and asked them and told them about the girl being abused.
and then it changed.
And that's why they were called the Humane Society, is because of those actions to protect humans. And that's what formed the very first Child and Family Services, which was in New York, and it was all in the 1870s. I thought it's also just kind of an interesting, wild, because I've also traveled in foreign countries where priests will talk to me about, this only happened once. I just told the story like it happens all the time. But I've met a priest in a foreign country. He was an American, and he talked about abuse he knew happening within his parish, and there was no outside entity to intervene. And that this is almost like a development of our society, that we like got this. And I just think it's weird that people just don't know the stories, and take it for granted that, of course, everyone would intervene.
You're right. And not everybody does. I mean, there's the whole issue of the bystander effect too, right? Where
Right.
somebody kind of sees something happening and somebody else will address it. And the more people you have around, the less likely somebody is to actually take action, which I've always found very interesting too. So that's one of the things that we talk about in the training too, is kind of overcoming any initial hesitation to take action. Because a
Right.
lot of times if somebody, if they think they have a suspicion of abuse, where we define suspicion, like we have an intentionally low bar. We say it's if the thought has entered your mind, you think a child may be experiencing abuse, right? That's our kind of threshold for suspicion. Whereas a lot of times people are like, well, maybe that's not what I saw, or I'm sure that wasn't their intention. We try to rationalize, and that's just human nature, because we think, what if I'm wrong?
Well, it is such a serious accusation, right? So it is such a, like, I'm sure there have been people in this whole cleanup of the Catholic Church who've been falsely accused, and that's pretty tragic.
It is, and it's something that I know I've heard, priests that are concerned about it, and I can understand that. But at the same time, that's why there's these investigation processes, right? Too. That's why every diocese has a review board, so they can review allegations, and that's separate from what's going on with the law enforcement investigation. So we want to take kind of everything, certainly seriously, but that's why there's an investigation, so that if you do have that situation where, hey, maybe there was a false allegation, the investigation process can help determine that. And there's a whole process in the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People for restoring a good name, if in the event that
Oh,
does
there
happen.
is? Oh,
There,
that's
there is.
interesting.
That is something that dioceses are required to have. That being said, we know that that's also, having a false allegation is also relatively rare for those
Okay.
to come forward with allegations. But that's why there's processes in place. And one thing I would say is, if we're kind of hesitant to report because we're worried, what if we're wrong? We certainly don't want to ruin somebody's reputation or whatnot. But if abuse is actually happening in that scenario, and we say, well, I'm not going to report because I'm worried if I'm wrong, and abuse is happening, now we're protecting an abuser. We're not
Right.
protecting the child. But if we flip it and say, well, what if I'm right and it is abuse, and now I'm protecting the child? And that's why it's so important to communicate those concerns.
There's also just kind of, there's an overlap between what you do and like protecting us from being kind of a cult.
Never heard that description before. I like it with that analogy.
I worry about it. I mean, like, if you look at the number of like new religious organizations that are like Simple House that fold into scandal, it's high. It's shockingly high in my opinion, right? And one of the things I wonder about is, how do you create a healthy corporate culture? Like, should you be able to make fun of the founder of your organization? Should you, just things like this, right? And I find that whenever anyone has a culture of everything's all right, or don't ask questions, something's going on. It might not be sex abuse. It could be an accounting scandal. You know what I mean? It could be who knows what. But like, if they have a aggressive defense, like they're putting the defense out there before you've even said something, it's like, okay, there's a cult-like thing happening.
I need to dig more,
fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. If somebody's unwilling to be transparent about anything in ministry, then questions should be asked. Right.
Yeah, that's one of the, I don't remember that being in the VIRTUS training particularly, but that is one of my call signs. It's like, if you're afraid of me asking questions, I need to be asking questions.
Exactly. We do kind of get into that a little bit, as far as like observing programs, and asking, what is the policy, to kind of just drop in and see what's going on, or what does the supervision look like in these ministries? So we kind of address it from that. But I hear what you're saying. You're right. Nobody should be above reproach, and especially leadership and everybody else. We all need to be held to the same standards. I mean, ultimately, that's why the bishop's reporting hotline came out a few years ago too. That if somebody does say, "Hey, I now have either an allegation or I'm reporting negligence by half of a bishop," they have somewhere specific to go. Whereas before, everything went through the diocese, and the bishop was the head of the diocese.
It has to go outside
the power structure, basically. Yeah,
exactly.
Wild. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Melanie. I mean, if there's anything else you want to say, I'd love to hear it. But you've answered all my questions.
Great. Thank you. No, I just, again, thank you for your time and talking through this. And I love just having the opportunity to talk a little bit more about abuse prevention, kind of what the everyday, what all of us can kind of do. So I appreciate it. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Thanks.